All right, so week one, again, we're talking about conflict and communication and how communication plays a central role in any conflict. We talked about that. Another thing we talked about is role expectations, okay? How no matter who or where you are in life, you are going to have expectations on you. Father, mother, husband, wife, friend, pastor, congregant. We all have roles, and we kind of sussed that out a little bit to see what that looked like. Number 3, we talked about, and this is what we're going to address this week, the different types of conflict that people have, destructive or constructive. Today we're going to look at number 3. Keep going. After that, next week, we're going to talk about communication within functional families, what that looks like. And then number 5, the last week, we're going to cover the biblical model for communication and conflict. So that's when we're going to take all the scripture and all the biblical references and points and really bring this home scripturally, okay? And so far we've talked about how communication plays a role in conflict, role expectations, and then go ahead and move to slide 28. We'll pick up for today and the different types of conflict communication, meaning that when we have conflict with somebody, there are a couple different ways that can show itself. Let me give the same kind of talk I gave last week. All of this information came from a course that I actually just finished my final project on. It's a psychology course, conflict and communication in the family. It's all academic theory. So what I did was I took those ideas and then I made them applicable to you and I. As a result, you're going to see some academic type language and gobbledygook. And so what I'm going to do is give lots of examples, stories, things of that nature in order so we can all better understand what I'm talking about, okay? So week 2, here we're starting the different types of conflict communication. And like we talked about last week, every one of us faces conflict almost on a daily basis. Every one of us. Some of this conflict is inside us, right? We have internal conflict. But a lot of it is between people, you and I, or you and a friend, you and your spouse, you and your children, you and your relatives, your family. And this is called interpersonal conflict, meaning it's between 2 or more people. And in this study, what we're doing, this teaching, I'm making some broad, what are called generalizations, meaning I'm think of it this way, like I'm an artist and I'm painting with real broad strokes instead of little finite, minute detail. Does everybody, could somebody shut the door? It's this door. Never mind. I got it. And the reason that I'm doing that, number 1, is to hit averages, meaning that in a typical fashion, these are how things typically work. There are always exceptions to the case, and we'll talk about that as we get into it, okay? Like everything in life, conflict is very, very complicated. And this week we're going to look at the third point, types of communication in conflict. I was originally going to try to do all of this teaching in 3 weeks, but it's not going to work. I'm going to need 4 weeks to properly cover everything. So let's go ahead and get into types of conflict in communication. And that is, there are 2 types of conflict in communication. It is destructive and constructive. Destructive communication and conflict, I'm pretty sure that we all know what the word destructive means. It's pretty self-explanatory, but I'll give you an example. Let's take building a house for an example. Another word for building is constructing, right? We construct a house. In order to construct a home, the first thing that we have to do is lay a foundation. That's what we do. We lay a foundation. Why? because everything that we build on that foundation is going to be supported by that foundation. But if the home's foundation is solid, then if a tornado comes or whatever, and it tears down the structure, the foundation is solid, you can build back on that foundation. But if the foundation is cracked, it doesn't matter how pretty the house is on top of the foundation, it will not be worth anything, and it will soon crumble, okay? So when we talk about destructive conflict, what I mean by that is that when we're in conflict with somebody, our actions and our words, our emotions are slowly chipping away at that foundation. Slowly but surely. We are chipping away at that foundation. And if that goes on long enough, it will not stand. The relationship, the home, whatever the situation is, it will not stand. Okay? And so, destructive communication is like tearing down a home instead of constructing a home. Okay? So it's destructing a home rather than constructing a home. And eventually, if we're destructive enough for long enough, that begins to affect our foundation. And once that's cracked, it's pretty much all over. When people are in a relationship, are in conflict, what we say to them, why we say what we say, and how we say it really matters. It really does. It's what a relationship is built on. How we communicate in conflict. So the question is, and it's a question I have to ask myself all the time, in our relationships, are we tearing down our home or are we constructing our home? And that's a constant thing that I have to do. And if we do go through a period of some destruction, are we quick to repair anything that got damaged? Because that's important. Because no matter how great our relationships are, in church, at home, at work, sometimes damage is going to happen. How quick are we to repair that damage? Or do we just hang a picture over it, right? So that's destructive communication and conflict. It tears the other person down. It causes damage to the foundation of the relationship. Now, within destructive communication and conflict, there are two types of destructive communication and conflict. One is overt, one is covert, and we're going to go over both of these so you can fully understand what I mean. Covert is defined as it's not openly shown, it's secret, veiled, or hidden. Overt is the exact opposite. It's openly shown, not secret, or hidden. First, we're going to talk about covert conflict in a destructive relationship. Covert conflict within a destructive relationship, okay? Covert, as I mentioned, is when we do not openly show or want to show that we are in conflict or are angry. That is covert destruction. We see this a lot between spouses or parents and their kids at church, especially because everybody wants to have this veneer of everything is good and perfect at church, right? And we may be really angry at our spouse or at a friend that we had conflict with last week, but no one would ever know it because it's covert. It is covert. We want everyone to think that what's going on is perfectly fine and good, okay? And so within covert, and you can tell this is an academic thing because it's like you have this and then a subheading of that and then a subheading of that subheading. And so within covert conflict, and we're going to go through each of these and I'll give examples for each, okay? But I'm going to list them first. Within covert destruction in conflict can take on five 5 different traits, and I'm going to list them first, then I'll give you examples for each. And I will get you the notes if you don't have them. I apologize. I left them at home. So within covert conflict, it can look like denial, what's called disqualification, displacement, disengagement, and what is called the biggest word of the day, and I'll explain it. It's called pseudo-mutuality, and I'll explain it. So remember, these are destructive, meaning not good, right? But they're very much real. And I was learning these, as I was learning these things in my class, I would often think of times where I saw this stuff in my family. I saw this stuff in myself, right? In relationships that I have had over the years. Okay, I'm going to briefly touch on each form of destructive covert communication. And as I said, give some examples. And if you don't understand, let me know. Okay, so the first one is denial. First one is denial. There we go. Denial. This is when a person's outward actions do not match their language. For example, a person gets angry at their spouse or friend, but instead of admitting that they're mad or hurt, they say, I'm fine. I'm fine. Nothing to see here. I'm not really mad, right? Meanwhile, their body language is saying they are very mad. Okay? So that's denial. I am denying that I'm hurt. Okay? And that's often unspoken, thus covert. Okay, covert. The second one is what is called disqualification. This is when a person expresses their hurt, but instead of then wanting to talk about it, they say, sorry, I was just upset. Sorry, I was. This is one step further than denial as far as communication is concerned, but it's still not wanting to talk about anything, and I expressed to my wife, hey, that what you said hurt me or bothered me, but then I disqualify that by saying, well, I was just upset. It's no big deal. Let's just move on. Okay, so we disqualify our anger, okay? And in other words, the person doesn't really want to deal with the problem. All right, 3 is what's called displacement. This happens when a person is angry at one person, but ends up yelling or picking an argument with someone else. You are displacing your anger. For example, your spouse or friend is angry at their boss, but yells at you instead, right? Or if they're not a yeller, per se, then they displace their anger in other ways, through passive-aggressive, through ignoring you, whatever the case may be, right? This person, when they do this, is trying to find an appropriate place to vent their anger. But it's often handled incorrectly. They are displacing their anger. The fourth one is disengagement, okay? This is avoiding each other and expressing hostility through lack of interaction. Where we completely avoid one another, we don't talk at all, right? In this situation, people normally will just wait for time to pass and then just move on without addressing the core issue. All right? So there's really no communication at all. Disengagement. And then the last one, the big one, is called pseudo-mutuality. This is where a family or a person has to appear perfect on the outside because no conflict is ever allowed to dispel the image of perfection. But anger is always simmering below the surface. I've known more than my fair share of people that their covert way of destructive communication in a relationship is this. To where at church or at work, they appear perfect. They make sure to never let on that something is wrong. Okay, but it only takes one little scratch off the veneer, and boom, that anger comes out. And then you can get into the displacement and all that other stuff, right? But generally how they work is pseudo-mutuality. All right, so The book also pointed out one more way that people can be covertly destructive, but I'm not going to get into that too much. Perhaps in the future we'll do a marriage class on it, but it's sex. It's sex. When a spouse withholds affection but does not express why. They simply ignore their marital responsibilities. Okay, I'm not going to get into that one too much. There's an appropriate time and place for that. So, as I said, it is for sure that I have engaged in some of these covert attempts to avoid conflict before. That is for sure. I think if we're honest with ourselves, if we take a close look at ourselves, I think we've all been guilty at one point or another of some of these covert, destructive conflict communication principles. Now, one of the reasons that this teaching is so important is so that we can identify the areas in which we struggle. If we go through life and we're constantly having struggles in our relationships or communication, but we never have a name for it, like we can't ever put our finger on it and say, yes, that's it. It's very hard to overcome that. And that's one of the important things behind this teaching. And I know that as I went through my class, many times I had an aha moment like, that's what that is. Like, I can see that in myself. I've totally done that. And so then that gives us then tools to begin to work on overcoming those. Okay? So, with destructive, covert, hearkening back to the first week, we are seeking to not acknowledge the dragon, right, in covert. In good communication, good conflict, because there is good conflict, we are seeking to give the dragon a name, to acknowledge the dragon. And you'll understand that. Those that didn't see the video last week, you'll understand that more when I show the video at the end, okay? So in relationships that struggle in these particular areas, you might hear things like, we can only rely on ourselves. Never air your dirty laundry to people outside of the family. All of these covert, destructive ways of dealing with conflict aim to avoid talking about the issues that are happening, to hide it from other people. These covert styles of conflict seek not to acknowledge the conflict or the dragon. They just want to ignore it. Okay? So that is our covert, destructive communication. Okay? Our communication can be destructive or constructive, which now we're talking about destructive. Okay? So destructive can be covert, which I just covered, or it can be overt. And this is where we get into some of the heavy stuff. Okay? Let's take a look at what destructive, overt conflict looks like. Overt conflict. Okay, next slide there. Okay, yes, thank you. This category also has some subcategories. There were 6 in my book, but I siphoned them down to 4 to make it more manageable, because 4 of them really cover everything within overt conflict. Okay, so here's what they are. And we'll go through each one with examples. 1 is emotional threats or damage. These are overt, destructive communication. Emotional threats or damage. 2 is verbal threats or damage. 3 is what is called the last straw. I'll explain that. And 4 is physical threats and damage. Let's go through each one of these. Let me mention this, that these overt categories can vary widely in scale and how they act out. Sometimes, except for the physical, except for the physical threats or damage, it's not always as bad as it could be or it may be. And I'll explain that as we go on, okay? So except for physical threats or damage, most of us, as you'll see, have been guilty of some of these things, even if to a lesser degree in our relationships over the years, Okay? So as I go through these, I want you to keep this in mind. If you recognize yourself in some of this, that you may struggle in one of these areas, the most important thing to do is that you've recognized the problem. Don't beat yourself up, and then you seek the Lord in wise counsel to do better. Okay? So the goal of this or any teaching or preaching is never to condemn. Condemnation does not come from the Lord, and we'll talk more about that in week 4 as we tie in the scriptural principles. So, all right, number 1, emotional threats and damage. And I'm starting with the emotional because the other 3 that I mentioned also involve emotional aspects as well. Right? If somebody's harming me physically, they are also harming me emotionally. Okay? And so overt emotional conflict can take lots of forms, from very, very minor and unintentional to very severe and very intentional. But regardless of the intent or level of severity, it still fits in this particular category. Emotional damage or threats can come from the type of person that always has to win an argument or a conflict. If you remember last week, we talked about the competitive, the I win, you lose type of mentality. Emotional damage oftentimes comes from that. When in a conflict, you may hear things, you may hear them say things that they normally would not, because winning the conflict is the most important thing. There are lots of examples of this, but I'll give one for the sake of time. 2 people get into conflict. One person expresses hurt, the other person ignores that hurt, or even makes fun or mocks the emotions of the other person. This is an example of this category. Making fun of, mocking the emotions of another person, that causes damage, right? Another example of this, I guess I wrote down another one, could be the words, "You are just like your mother. You are just like your father." Very, very harmful. Again, that's less on the severity scale, right? But it's still there. Nonetheless, man, I have said that to my wife. "You're just like your mother." And she has said to me, "You're just like every bad person in the world." Right? Because she loves my dad, actually. So, no, in that regard, she says I'm like my mother, which is true. So we have said that to one another, you know, and so, but it can cause emotional damage. So number 2, verbal threats. Okay, these are more direct messages of hostility. Things like, "I hate you. Why can't you do anything right?" Right? And again, these vary in severity. Vary. In this category, verbal threats or damage, we see ultimatums given. "If you ever do that again, I will blank. I will leave you. If you ever do that again, I will do this." Right? Sometimes, and I like to make this caveat here, sometimes in a parent-child relationship, ultimatums must be given, and that's not what I'm talking about here. That's a parent disciplining a child. Both people aren't on equal footing there, so that's not what I'm talking about, right? Like, if you don't do your homework, you will be grounded. That's not verbal threats or damage. As far as destructive communication goes, right? Matter of fact, I would probably call that, depending on the circumstance, constructive, because you are teaching and training your child in the way they should go, which is part of our biblical mandate as parents, right? And so that is not what I'm talking about. This is mainly between 2 adults, you know, or 2 children, you know, something like that, all right? So let me skip down. So another example, as far as destructive between adults, friends, spouses, if you don't take out the garbage, you'll be sleeping on the couch. Something like that, right? These have no place in a healthy relationship. None. Another example is you and someone close to you eat dinner together. When you finish, you put your dishes in the sink, okay? Then you go about your business. About an hour later, the person comes to you and says, in the future, could you please put your dishes in the dishwasher so the kitchen isn't a mess? This is a normal conversation in many houses. Rather than respond with some sort of goodwill, you say, well, I've cleaned up your dishes 3 times this week. Something like that. So we respond in a manner of we are doing verbal damage or threats. Actually, this is how I have it written down. I've cleaned up your dishes earlier this week, and speaking of messes, what about that closet? Right? So we've all, when we're confronted with something, it's easy to go on the defensive and want to defend ourselves immediately. Right? We're feeling attacked, so we are going to verbally attack back. Yeah, me? What about you? So that's an example of verbal threats and damage. Okay? Not good. Not good. 3 is the last straw. This is the third destructive conflict style, and it's called the last straw. This is when a person builds up smaller resentment and anger over time, and then seemingly out of nowhere, we dump the whole mess on someone. The last straw. Along their way, there will have been many unresolved conflicts hanging out in what we talked about last week, the follow-up stage of conflict. They're just hanging out there, right? Not being addressed. For example, when a couple all of a sudden separate or get a divorce, and it just seems like out of nowhere. More than likely, they've been ignoring the dragons for a long, long time. Until one person finally snaps and admits that there is indeed a dragon. But sometimes does so in an unhealthy way, sometimes in a healthy way, but the other person refuses to admit it. Okay? So the last straw. Here's where long-term friendships will break apart due to years of ignoring the issues in the relationships. Obviously, the goal is to not build up this kind of resentment, but even if it happens, there are healthy ways to deal with these last straw issues. Healthy ways to respond to a person who might be in this situation. Okay? And we're going to talk about that next week as we get into constructive communication and conflict. 4 is physical threats or damage. Okay? We'll do this one. I've got 2 stories to tell you. And then we will be done for this week. Next week, as I said, we're going to pick up constructive conflict communication. So 4, physical threats or damage. Like the verbal threats category, the relationship between a parent and a child, and this is the caveat I'm making here, is like a punishment like spanking, corporal punishment. That is not what this category is about. Again, this is between 2 adults or even 2 children, and this is not about proper godly discipline in a house, right? That said, if the physical discipline is done for the wrong reason or is too harsh, then it definitely fits this category. And sometimes it's easy to cross that line. But normal corporal punishment in a house is different. So this teaching is on interpersonal conflict between 2 people, not parent and child discipline. Outside of that parent-child relationship, corporal proper discipline, physical threats and damage have no place whatsoever for any reason ever. It's best to walk away. I do want to note that any person in a relationship where they are receiving physical threats or damage should exit stage left until the people that are doing those things, number 1, see their need for help, and number 2, get help. And maybe you're wondering why I would even cover this aspect of destructive conflict in a church setting. And this is why. I'm going to tell you why. Because the church never talks about this sort of thing, ever. We don't even like to approach the topic of emotional and verbal conflict let alone physical damage. I have two stories, real life examples. One that fits the physical category, while the other one fits the verbal and emotional category. Okay, and then that's where we'll end. I'll show the video. Can you hear me, Tisha? No? Okay. That's where she's one of the ones who wanted to see it. So at the end, she can come in and see it. But I'm not going to show it
the microphone?
quite yet. It should be. Anyway, okay. So my first story again is about the physical damage, and this story is about a good.
It's on.
Oh, it is. Okay. This story is about a good friend of mine that I had as a teenager. I'm going to call him Reuben. That was actually his nickname, but not his real name, right? So Reuben was a really, really good kid. He was one of the best I had ever seen at baseball, and just about anything he had put his mind to. Reuben's dad shared his actual real first name. But Reuben's dad coached we were on the same baseball team, coached our baseball team. He would come out in the driveway, play basketball with us kids. The family were very faithful in church, claimed to be believers, and from all outside appearances, the family looked very, very healthy. They had, 3 kids, a nice house. The dad had a great job. The mom stayed at home, took care of the house and such. So one evening, I was over at my friend's house, Reuben's house. Myself and another friend were there down in Reuben's basement watching a TV show. And Reuben's dad was down there as well. And Reuben, if you can imagine in your mind's eye, was laying on the floor on his stomach with his feet behind him up in the air, kind of bent at the knee. And every once in a while, his foot would brush up against his dad. And his dad told him a couple of times to put his legs down because he was also blocking the TV. On the third time that his dad told him this, Reuben rolled his eyes like every kid does, right? All of a sudden, Reuben's dad jumps up off the couch, grabs Reuben by the hair, and begins punching his face over and over and over. I was absolutely stunned. I had never seen anything like this in my young life at that point. The dad dragged Reuben up the stairs by his hair into Reuben's room, mounted his chest, and began to rain blows down on his face. His mom yelled at us to leave. So we did. I would end up seeing similar things happen to Reuben every once in a while. Another example I don't have in my notes is we were all out playing basketball, and Reuben accidentally blocked his dad a little bit too hard, so his dad just hauled off and just punched him right in the face, right in front of all of us, right outside, in front of everyone, right? Now, up to that day, in that basement, I had no clue that anything like that was going on in that house. And even though I was just a kid, I understood exactly how wrong that was. You don't need to be very old to understand how wrong that was. So a day or two after that first incident, I asked my friend how long his dad had been doing that. I said, that sort of thing. And Reuben replied, what sort of thing? I said, punching you and pulling your hair, for crying out loud. He said to me, doesn't your dad do that to you? Even as a teenager, I was blown away by his response to my question. See, to Reuben, what happened to him was normal. He thought that's how everyone lived. I can guarantee you that these topics were never brought up in that church. I am 46 years old. I have never once, in all of my years, ever heard any sermon or talk about physical abuse, about emotional abuse, about, verbal. Like, sometimes it'll get thrown into a little part of a message, but like never a solid teaching on this stuff. And so when I took this class, I'm like, this is it. Like, this needs to be sussed out. This needs to be understood and presented, because it is such an important part of our daily walk with Christ is conflict and communication. And the more we can understand ourselves, the better we can get in our relationship with God and our relationship with others. So that's my story about the physical threats and damage. That's a pretty dark story, right? I think I've shared that one other time. Never from a pulpit, never, like on a Sunday morning type of situation. Like, it's just too heavy. So the second story is all about the more verbal and emotional. And the second story isn't as traumatic, but it's still disturbing, okay? This story takes place a number of years ago. It was during my first ever job as pastor, and there was a family in the church that I had been helping because their daughters were struggling with drug abuse. Well, Thanksgiving time came around, and they asked me if I wanted to go eat Thanksgiving meal with them. Normally, Laura, myself, and Sam would spend Thanksgiving together, but Laura had arranged for her and Sam to go down to her mother's for Thanksgiving. And there's a number of reasons I didn't go with them, but that's a story for a different time, right? But that left my day open in order to go spend it with a church family, okay? Now, I knew already that this church family wasn't the most healthy family in the world. Like, I got that. I knew that. You didn't have to interact with them too much to know that, okay? They had some problems, but you never know what goes on behind closed doors, just like my first story, right? So I decided to take them up on their invitation, so I did. Now, mind you, these are very prominent people in the church. I think they truly love the Lord and all of that, right? So I get to their house. It's Thanksgiving Day. I get there in the later afternoon, about 4 o'clock. We were supposed to have the meal at 5, okay? And I figured I'd spend a couple hours with them, eat, and then head back home. When I walked in the door, the first thing I noticed was that no one spoke with each other. All communication was yelling, not speaking. It was yelling at each other, not speaking to each other. The family had 2 adult daughters, one of which had a young child that the grandparents took care of 99% of the time because the daughter was never around, and they all lived together in this house. So I got there, I'm observing, I'm looking at everything that's going on. It's very loud, lots of yelling. So I sit down on the couch and I'm trying to talk to them, but it's almost impossible. So I'm just observing them interact with one another, yelling back and forth like it was madness. Then I find out that the meal will not be ready until minimum 8 o'clock. So as the pastor, I couldn't simply walk out. You know what I'm saying? Like, I got to be nice. So I sit there, right? And I'm sitting there waiting for this meal to be done, trying to be friendly in conversation. And all of a sudden, one of the adult daughters starts to get into a verbal altercation with her dad. And they were going back and forth, yelling, cussing, swearing at one another for probably, no kidding, no exaggeration, 20 straight minutes. Until the dad gets so angry, he kicks the poor dog. Right. He gets so angry, he kicks the poor dog. Fast forward, the meal is finally ready. Right? I am ready. It took about literally 30 minutes to get everybody seated, because in a house like that, no task is simple. Where everybody is yelling at each other, no one wants to do what the other person says, so no task is simple. As easy as sitting down at a table is. So we all sit down, wait a while for everyone to quiet down long enough, and they ask me to pray. So as pastorally as possible, I began to thank the Lord for the food. And right in the middle of my prayer, the grandma yells at the top of her lungs at the little kid who is reaching for a biscuit. Don't touch that biscuit! I mean, loud, right in the middle of my prayer, and then slaps his hand. Not hard, but... Now, mind you, my prayer was only about 10 seconds long. It was not a long bless the missionaries prayer. You know what I'm saying? It's like, let's eat, I'm out of here. Amen. And they couldn't even get through a 7-second prayer without somebody yelling at another person. Like, she couldn't have waited. Anyway, so it was by far my worst Thanksgiving ever, and probably one of the most worst Thanksgiving in history. I'm just guessing, though. I don't know. The amount of emotional and verbal destruction that was going on was out of this world, man. It was so unhealthy. It was so ugly. And as I said, the grandma and grandpa were one of the most prominent people in the church. Now, those are some, hopefully, extreme examples. But they taught me to always keep in mind that we never know what goes on behind closed doors. We never know what sort of teaching a person might benefit from while they're in the safety of the church, right? If they're in a damaging relationship. Okay, so we're going to end this teaching here this week. Next week, we're going to start with a much lighter, more Pollyanna type of subject with constructive, right? This was the worst of it. Constructive communication. And next week is when we're going to begin to apply all of this stuff. All of these things we've talked about week 1 and 2. Next week, when we're talking about constructive communication, we're going to be beginning to apply. And then week 4 is when we tie it all in scripturally. Because even though this teaching may seem like it's not based on biblical principles, it very, very much is. Matter of fact, when I was learning it in class, I was stunned how closely aligned it is with the biblical model and definition of a healthy family and healthy relationships. And we'll pull all that out in week 4. Okay, but starting next week, we're going to begin to apply everything that we have talked about thus far. So I said before, and I'll end with this, then we'll watch that video. I think that the church has been negligent in not addressing these particular issues, and that's one of the reasons I decided to do this Wednesday night series. And my goal is, after this series is complete, to go back, refine it, make it better, and then I want to teach it once a year, at the minimum. Once we grow, we get more people, maybe twice a year. Maybe on a Sunday morning, like a Sunday school type of thing, and a Wednesday night, something, because I think it's just so lacking, and these things, they give us great tools in order to first identify the problem weeks 1 and 2, and then weeks 3 and 4 to actually apply solving or go in the process of solving the problem. So I think it's really good, and I'm learning along with all of you. So they say one of the best ways to learn something is to teach it. So that's that. All right, is Mr. Josh back there? He is not. Okay. Oh, here he comes. All right. Could you turn off the camera? Thank you, bud. And then start the video, and just make sure that it's turned up.